Anyway, I want to begin with some slides. Well, I'll do 3 or 4 slides, and then we'll take a little break, and I'll talk some, and then we'll finish up with some images. And we think we've got this lighting figured out perfectly. We will soon see. But these slides are somewhat confessional in nature, because to tell you the truth, I never thought I was going to write a book about slavery. I never thought I was going to write a book about captivity. I certainly never thought I was going to write a book that won all these prizes. I thought I was going to be a labor historian. And I was going to work in the coal fields of southern Colorado, coal mine featured here, and looking specifically at the experience of Hispano people who had settled in this region in the 1850s and 60s and had made the drastic transition from semi-subsistence farmers and pastoralists to wage laborers in a really heavily industrial coal industry. Next one, please. So I thought I was going to be working on, can we go ahead? Thanks, Gunther. On the peoples who had occupied ghost towns like this, a ghost town called Berwyn in southern Colorado, and how they had come from, next slide, villages like this, Madrid Plaza, in the same region, and been drawn out of those villages and into industrial labor in this transition. So I had been spending quite a long time working on this project, and including doing quite a lot of oral history, interviewing these now miners in their 70s and 80s who had literally lived through the most dramatic part of this transformation in their lives. And had I gone up and down the Purgatoire River Valley interviewing people, and next one, please. One day I visited Ray and Sadie Correro, and this is their original homestead in the village of Los Aramillos in the valley, now known as Weston. They were now living in a small trailer, mobile home, off on to the right of this site. And I had spent the day talking with Ray and Sadie about their experiences in this transition. Ray had gone into the mines when he was in his 20s, had worked the 3-foot-tall seams in those mines till his knees were absolutely blown out and he was unable virtually to walk. Instead of retiring at that point, which wasn't an option, nor was disability an option, he then took on another job, and that was defined as the fire boss. Fire boss is not the one who plunges the dynamite plunger and creates the explosion. Fire boss is the man who carries the safety lamp with a flame in it into the mines in the mornings. He did so on his knees. He could, by reading the height of the flame, he could tell the men who were to come after him whether or not it was safe to work that day, because the flame would increase the amount of the gas in the air in the mine. Ray was dedicated to this work. He took pride in the work, and actually in the 1940s, when the mine attempted to introduce an automated safety lamp, Ray challenged it to a duel, a la John Henry, and he won. That he had a finer sense of how to test for gas than did the automatic machine. Anyway, Ray had spent the day talking with me. One of the things I always did was collect genealogies in these. And Ray had spent a lot of time explaining to me how his ancestors had come into the valley, migrating up from northern New Mexico, from Las Trampas, Santa Fe, Albuquerque, in that area. And he traced that line back all the way through Mexico to peninsular Spain. And it was very important to Ray that I understand that his family were Spaniards and that they had an unbroken line of descent back to the conquistadors of the early modern era. And at one moment, Ray excused himself, left the kitchen, and Sadie turned to me and conspiratorially whispered to me, she said, "You know, his grandmother was an Apache." And it wasn't the first time I had heard this. It was the first time I had heard it within a family. I had heard it often about other families. One family would describe another family as, oh, you know, they're nothing but Apaches walking around as Spaniards, right? But this is what got my attention. And this is what led me into the project that ultimately became this book. I decided I need to understand what it is about this tension between the need for a busted-out coal miner like Recorero to feel in his heart that he was pure Spaniard running back 400 years, and the contradiction in the fact that he was part Indian. Well, and I never got to answering that question. We can cut the slides for now and bring these lights back. I'm blinded up here. Why don't we just turn the slides off for now? Yeah, we can go back to it. I never managed to answer the question that had first intrigued me, because I had to begin going backward to try to find Ray's Apache grandmother, had to find the many hundreds and even thousands of Apache, Comanche, Pawnee, Ute, Navajo grandmothers who were out there in the Spanish-American past. And in doing so, I pushed myself back into the 19th century, the 18th century, the 17th century, finally the 16th century, and then began to run the story forward. And by 1880, I ran out of gas. You know, I just had nothing left. That this book was already too big, the story was already too complicated, and so I needed to end it. And so there's much work yet to be done, and some people are working on the question. But what I found was, yes, literally thousands of Indian women and children brought into Spanish colonial society through forms of captivity and slavery that were always illegal under Spanish law. From 1540 and again in 1680, the King of Spain specifically forbade the enslavement of Indian peoples. And yet, through various forms of subterfuge, Spaniards all over the New Spain, but especially in New Mexico, found ways of working around this. They constantly disguised it as forms of kinship. The women and children who would come into their families were designated as criadas, people raised up, lifted up from barbarism to civilization through these acts of capture and purchase. So it was Christian charity at work, in the case of the Spaniards at least. They formed at any given time from 10 to 30% of Spanish colonial society. And obviously, when you have that many people in the society, you have a lot of Apache grandmothers floating around out there. So that was one movement of people, but simultaneous to that, I discovered there was another movement of people. And that was that as Indian women and children were being brought into Spanish colonial society, so too were Spanish and Mexican women and children being captured and drawn into Indian societies, especially among Comanches, Navajos, and some cases Apaches as well, but Comanches and Navajos principally. I had never imagined that this was going to be part of the story, beginning just literally by the handful, and then by the hundreds, and then by the 19th century, by the thousands. Women and children seized, especially out of northern Mexico, and assimilated into Comanche and Navajo encampments in forms of servitude that they later told ethnographers working on linguistics that, yes, nalte means slave. And I found myself thinking, wow, this is something new. This is the story of a form of American slavery, but among people and in a place we had never imagined as part of the American slave narrative. And that's where this book really kind of began and flowed for me. But I realized that was an important element of the kind of the historical context of what I was trying to tell. There was another element that dawned on me as I worked on this project that was heavily anthropological in forms. One of the reasons I'm back at the School of American Research, this kind of elite research center in Santa Fe, New Mexico. I was just saying, nearly 100 years old. Franz Boas was one of our presidents. But I realized what this case I was working on gave me was one of the rare cases we have in world historical terms where you can actually see a slave system emerge. It's born, it elaborates, grows more complex, and then ultimately it disappears, only with the intervention of the American Civil War in the West after 1865. And so I had another strain, a mainstream and a main theme in American history to tie into, that in fact the American Civil War did not end in 1865. The American War Against Slavery didn't end in 1865. It extended into the American West, especially into the Southwest, as a war against the kind of political economic relationships that underpinned the Southwestern slave system. And I was able then to understand that this transition finally did not complete itself until the 1880s, when, for the most part, American military power was sufficiently strong to put a stop to the kind of endemic slave raiding that had characterized the last 350 years. And yet it continued in other forms. By 1909, there's a Navajo headman, Hoshkanini, who, when he dies, he wills his 32 Ute slaves to his adoptive granddaughter. This is in the 20th century, and it's right there. So the institution persists. So I think what I want to do now is to work through some images, slides that some of which you would see in the book and some of which you won't, just to give you kind of a sampling and a flavor of the different forms slavery could take and the different kinds of analysis that was necessary to do it. So if we can go to the next slide. All right. Is that in focus? I can't see from here, but okay. In northern New Mexico, there is a region called the Dineta, which translates as the place of Navajo origins. It's where the Navajo people went from being this kind of hard to define Athabascan-speaking group to the Diné, or the people we know as the Navajo. If you wander around that country, you find literally hundreds of archaeological sites that look like this. Not what we would usually expect to imagine with Navajos. Next slide, please. For instance, this site called El Castillo, the castle. For many years, archaeologists knew of these sites and assumed them to be built by Pueblo peoples from the northern Rio Grande, who had probably fled the area after the Spanish Reconquista in 1692 to 1696, had moved way up into this distant border country and had built classic kind of Pueblo masonry architectural fortresses. They were called the fortresses of the Pueblitos. And yet, the puzzle here was that although the architecture looked Puebloan, the material culture did not. The basketry, the ceramics, the lithics, the ceremonial complexes all looked Navajo. Next, please. And it presented a problem, a major explanatory dilemma, that who on earth were these people? Well, we've come to understand that, in fact, yes, this is the place that Navajo became Navajo. They became the Diné, but they did so by assimilating outside people. More than a third of the 64 Navajo clans claim descent from clan ancestresses of non-Navajo origin. Some of the earliest of those alien clans, as they're called, hail back to Pueblo women who were captured by Athabascan raiders, brought up into this country, and assimilated as kin who then ultimately become the foundational women behind clans like the Zia clan, or the Jemez clan, or the Sandia clan, or the Coyote Pass clan. And we came then to understand that what was happening here was a translation of Puebloan culture into what was becoming Navajo society, where certain elements like architecture became important parts of ultimately who would become Navajo. It was by bringing the women and children out of the Pueblos and into Navajo society that we get an explanation for these phenomena. Next one, please. Here's another rock top site called the Three Corn Ruin. You can see just how dramatic some of this country is. It's spectacular. Not generally open to the public, but it may be someday. Next one, please. What we also have are sites that don't look Puebloan either. And this too was a puzzle. This is a site called the Old Fort Ruin that when archaeologists first started looking at it, they scratched their heads and they said, this looks like a medieval Iberian town. This looks like a Spanish castle. What's going on here? This tall wall, this is a 12-foot tall wall, runs all the way across the neck of a mesa that goes out. Next, please. And inside this wall, you see really quite classic European architecture. This is a fortified entryway into the old fort site that allowed for a barricade to be built across the entryway to prohibit traffic. Next one, please. And yet inside the old fort ruin, you also have what is considered classically Navajo architecture. This is called a fork stick hogan. This is the kind of dwellings that Navajos used before they moved out into the pastoral country and began building the classic hexagonal hogans. And so we have more than a few of these sites where we have kind of oddly Spanish-looking things, some Navajo-looking things. There's large fortifications. And there too is an explanation for this, and specifically one that we have pretty good historic documentation for, because right about the time of the Pueblo Revolt in 1680, a group of Navajos raid down into a region south of Albuquerque called Socorro, and they take captive 2 young Spanish women, one named Almazan and one named Peralta, and run them back up into this country. Never heard from again, except in the 1740s, Franciscans began to launch exploratory expeditions up into this area, and they run across villages that they, in their reports, identify as, in one case, Pueblo de los Coyotes, meaning the village of the peoples of mixed descent. Another one, Pueblo de los Españoles, village of the Spaniards, right? And in both of these cases, when Franciscans arrived, they discovered that the people actually understood the liturgy. They understood how Catholic practice was supposed to proceed. Next, please. And in many of them, there's this really startling kind of architectural feature, and that is a fireplace that has no resemblance at all to the classic central hearth of the Athabascan tradition, but is almost a perfect image of a Spanish colonial corner fireplace. And what we imagine is that these captive women, who became the clan ancestresses of what would be known today as the Nakaidine, or the Mexican clan of the Navajo, in their captivity had the capacity to shape the way that their lives unfolded around them, to the point of helping to design not only the village architecture, but even down to their own cooking hearths. So that's the Navajo case. Let's go to another one here. How about among Comanches, classic horsemen, lords of the southern plains, horsemen like these doing their trick riding. Next, please. A classic Comanche raid painted by George Catlin in 1832. Comanches famous for their raiding. And here is a Comanche encampment from about the same time. And the thing to notice here is what the women are doing in the foreground. The women are preparing hides, which is classic women's work in the 18th century among the Comanches in the 19th century. But something had begun to change in dramatic and ultimately devastating ways with the hide trade. By the time this painting was made, the horse and the gun had completely transformed the way Indian men hunted and procured bison. In the pre-horse, pre-gun period, an Indian man hunting during the course of a year might take 9 to 12 bison. It takes about 30 days for a woman to process a bison hide to the point of its being usable. With the horse and the gun, capacity for Comanche men to take bison was up around 40 to 50 animals a year. Now, why would you take 40 or 50 animals a year if in the classic Indian way all you're doing is eating everything down to the last breath, right? Well, by 1830s, but certainly even earlier than that, there was another reason to hunt bison, and that was because there was a market economy. American traders were in the West, moving up the Arkansas and the Platte rivers, and buying bison hides as fast as Indians could procure them. And when you have a man taking 40 or 50 hides a year, for which there are avid buyers at places like Bent's Fort and elsewhere, you have to have somebody to process those hides. And there were certainly not enough Comanche women in the encampments to do so. And so from the 18-teens on, you see a spike in raids to capture women from Spanish and later Mexican villages. And in all the extant captivity narratives we have from this period, the women say, I wasn't treated badly, but boy, I was put to work tanning hides so quickly, and I had to work so hard to produce these hides. And so you see there's this engine, an economic engine, driving and underpinning what becomes a classic exercise in pastoral slavery of reaching out and taking women to help produce commodities. Next, please. For instance, in the 1850s, I'd seen this painting for years before it finally dawned on me what was going on here. If you look, this is Baron von Mulhausen. This is a Kiowa encampment. And look at the clothing of the women on the left. This is not classic Kiowa women's clothing. These look like Mexican peasant women, right? And the Kiowas, too, were entering into this same process of seizing women out of northern Mexico. And I think that I argue in the book that this is actually a painting of some of those women. Next, please. The Kiowa, in fact, had a category called dapom, into which slaves were inserted. And even Kiowas could be, or other Indian people, could be made into dapom. In this painting of the headman Little Mountain, number 6 here on the lower right, you have two people designated, number 2 and number 3, as attendants of Little Mountain. They're not even given names. Almost certainly this is a representation of Little Mountain's dapom, or slaves, that he kept in his household, both for their labor value, but also for the prestige value of having dependents that he could feature in public ways as dependent upon him. Next, please. Here is a painting I ran across in the Beinecke Library. The Spanish girl, parens, a prisoner. She had recently been captured by Little Mountain's son and given to Little Mountain as a gift wife. She had been seized out of northern Mexico. Next, please. Not all elements of this involved women. Well, ultimately, this one did too. This is a painting of a Comanche warrior made in 1832 by Catlin again. He very carefully writes down the Comanche's name. And he writes, He Su Sanchez. You don't have to say that very fast or very often before you figure out that this is Jesus Sanchez, right? He's called the half-breed in Catlin's notes. He's descended from a Spanish captive mother and a Comanche captain. Jesus Sanchez actually is quite an important figure in Comanche society, leader of war parties, raider, but Catlin notes that he was always put in the most dangerous position at the very front of raids, always the one who came out to greet strangers and the dragoons when they were out there. And Comanches explained that while we respect him a great deal, we can also afford to lose him. And so they would put him in that role. Very similar to the role of captive or slave women in Kiowa sun dances. Although she was honored, dressed beautifully, she would go out, cut the center pole, bring it back for the Sundance grounds. Kiowa said she had to be beautiful because she was doing something very sacred, but she had to be someone else because this was very dangerous as well. And bad things could happen, and we didn't want it to happen to one of our women. Next, please. Also in the 1850s, this pious gentleman, one of my more favorite characters in the book, fellow goes by the trade name of Toro Mucho, many bulls, or much bull, if you want to say. Probably more of the latter than the former. And underneath it's called Chief of a Band of Kiowas. Well, he's encountered by the border survey people, and in fact, he's not a chief of a band. Well, maybe he is a chief of a band of Kiowas, but he's not Kiowa. He's not Kiowa. He's an escaped Mexican peon from an hacienda in northern Mexico who has fallen in with a group of Kiowa livestock raiders. He's actually encountered driving some thousands of head of livestock back across the Rio Grande toward the southern plains where they could be sold to American buyers. So this is another element of the kind of the bleeding and crossing of ethnic boundaries that occurs in this kind of slave system, where someone like Toro Mucho probably began his life as Andres Martinez. He becomes Toro Mucho in time and a leader of a band of Kiowa Indians as a consequence of this raiding economy. Next, please. Now, it goes different ways. Not only are Spaniards going into Indian society, but so too are Indian peoples coming into Spanish colonial society. If we can focus this a little bit better, I don't know. You'll have to buy my book to see the better image of this. It's on the cover, but this is a hide painting that's in the Museum of New Mexico, the Palace of the Governors in Santa Fe. We've all admired it for years, wondered what it was. And I think I figured it out, and I make this argument in the book, that what you have here, and you'll see a second one that's better, but this is a raid. There's a group of mounted horsemen on the left, a group of defenders on the right, men without horses, spears, and what's most important here is behind the palisade what they're fighting about, the women. All right? Can we go to the next one? The thing that finally jumped out at me, and you don't see all the horsemen here, but you see some, this is the cavalry unit, that we had pretty much assumed this was a group of Spaniards raiding an Indian encampment. There's something strange. They look like Spaniards. They have Spanish weapons. They have the great leather armor that Spaniards would put on their horses. And yet, look at their headdresses. Those don't look like Spanish military headdresses. In fact, they look like Indian headdresses. And spectacularly, every single one is different. Now, why would a neophyte artist in Spanish Mission paint a painting like this and put a different Indian headdress on every one of these Spanish cavalrymen? Well, I argue in the book that this is actually the representation of what's called a Genízaro slave raid. Genízaro is a caste of slaves that develops in New Mexico, formed from the captives that New Mexicans, that Spaniards are buying from other Indian peoples because the slave trade draws from all over the southern plains. And they ultimately become a slave soldiery. Genízaro is the Spanish word for janissary, the slave soldiers of the Ottoman Empire. They too were drawn from all over the Balkans, from different ethnic groups. And in New Mexico, the only place in Spanish America, you have this phenomenon of whole communities of Genízaros forming up, being placed in frontier locations to protect the colony from Indian raiders, and yet simultaneously to act as slave raiders themselves. And so I think what we have here is an artistic representation of a Genízaro raid on probably an Apache encampment. And what better way, if you're an illiterate artist, to show the multi-ethnic character of the Genízaro squad than to put a different headdress on every person. You can show that they're Pawnees, Arapahoes, Utes, Apaches, all the way down. And we can't read the headdresses by tribal affiliation, but that's my supposition here. Next, please. So Genízaros play this very central function in protecting the colony and continuing the slave trade, and they are put in these distant locations on the frontiers to protect the colony. Most of these now look like this. It's a place called Las Casitas up toward Ojo Caliente. Not much left of these Genízaro outposts. This one is just, the chapel here is just melting back into the earth whence it came. But there are a few communities today that are marginally alive, that have Genízaro foundations. Go to the next slide. One of these is east of Santa Fe along the Pecos River, in full flood here, called San Miguel del Vado, or San Miguel of the Ford. It's the place where the Santa Fe Trail actually crossed the Pecos River on its way to Santa Fe. Next, please. It is largely, too, melting back into the earth. Very quiet and peaceful spot. Next, please. But it does have some residents still, and is actually trying to struggle and rebuild itself. Unfortunately, the interstate bypassed it, and so everything went south from there. But here's the church in San Miguel. Next, please. And I did some oral histories in this village at the same time as some of the others. And on one side of the plaza, the classic square plaza, that was the core of the village in colonial and 19th century times, I interviewed the woman who lived in this house. She had done a lot of work on it, brought it, kind of put it back together, actually managed to get it on the National Register, and had a wonderful day with her. And toward the end of the day, I asked her, I say, Kathy, that you know, what the document suggests that San Miguel was founded by, you know, of the 30 original settlers, at least 13 of them were Genízaros, were these kind of Indian slaves, right? And she said, oh, yeah, that's true. Next slide, please. And she looked across the plaza. This would have been the teeming central plaza of the village, full of oxen and wagons and all in the 19th century. She pointed over here to these on the far side, and she said, you know, and that was the Genízaro side over there. And if you go over and talk to them, notice, they're darker than we are. And so here, in the middle of the 1990s, there was this continuation, this pulling forward of this story of Southwestern slavery, even up to the point that people were making racial distinctions across a dusty plaza in a virtually abandoned village in northern New Mexico. So I think I might stop there and see if we have some questions. I know people have a long way to go to that. Trailer, mobile home, off on to the right of this site. And I had spent the day talking with Ray and Sadie about their experiences in this transition. Ray had gone into the mines when he was in his 20s, had worked the 3-foot-tall seams in those mines till his knees were absolutely blown out and he was unable virtually to walk. Instead of retiring at that point, which wasn't an option, nor was disability an option, he then took on another job, and that was defined as the fire boss. Fire boss is not the one who plunges the dynamite plunger and creates the explosion. Fire boss is the man who carries the safety lamp with a flame in it into the mines in the mornings. He did so on his knees. He could, by reading the height of the flame, he could tell the men who were to come after him whether or not it was safe to work that day, because the flame would increase the amount of the gas in the air in the mine. Ray was dedicated to this work. He took pride. Next one, please. So I thought I was going to be working on, can we go ahead? Thanks, Gunther. On the peoples who had occupied ghost towns like this, ghost town called Berwyn in southern Colorado, and how they had come from, next slide, villages like this, Madrid Plaza, in the same region, and been drawn out of those villages and into industrial labor in this transition. So I had been spending quite a long time working on this project, and including doing quite a lot of oral history, interviewing these now miners in their 70s and 80s who had literally lived through the most dramatic part of this transformation in their lives. And had I gone up and down the Purgatoire River Valley interviewing people, and next one, please. One day I visited Ray and Sadie Correro, and this is their original homestead in the village of Los Aramillos in the valley, now known as Weston. They were now living in a small site in the work, and actually in the 1940s, when the mine attempted to introduce an automated safety lamp, Ray challenged it to a duel, a la John Henry, and he won. That he had a finer sense of how to test for gas than did the automatic machine. Anyway, Ray had spent the day talking with me. One of the things I always did was collect genealogies in these. And Ray had spent a lot of time explaining to me how his ancestors had come into the valley, migrating up from northern New Mexico, from Las Trampas, Santa Fe, Albuquerque, in that area. And he traced that line back all the way through Mexico to peninsular Spain. And it was very important to Ray that I understand that his family were Spaniards and that they had an unbroken line of descent back to the conquistadors of the early modern era. And at one moment, anyway, I want to begin with some slides. Well, I'll do 3 or 4 slides, and then we'll take a little break, and I'll talk some, and then we'll finish up with some images. And we think we've got this lighting figured out perfectly. We will soon see. But these slides are somewhat confessional in nature, because to tell you the truth, I never thought I was going to write a book about slavery. I never thought I was going to write a book about captivity. I certainly never thought I was going to write a book that won all these prizes. I thought I was going to be a labor historian. And I was going to work in the coal fields of southern Colorado, coal mine featured here, and looking specifically at the experience of Hispano people who had settled in this region in the 1850s and 60s and had made the drastic transition from semi-subsistence farmers and pastoralists to wage laborers in a really heavily industrial coal industry. Ray excused himself, left the kitchen, and Sadie turned to me and conspiratorially whispered to me, she said, "You know, his grandmother was an Apache." And it wasn't the first time I had heard this. It was the first time I had heard it within a family. I had heard it often about other families. One family would describe another family as, oh, you know, they're nothing but Apaches walking around as Spaniards, right? But this is what got my attention. And this is what led me into the project that ultimately became this book. I decided I need to understand what it is about this tension between the need for a busted-out coal miner like Ray Correro to feel in his heart that he was pure Spaniard running back 400 years, and the contradiction in the fact that he was part Indian. Well, and I never got to answering that question. We can cut the slides for now and bring these lights back. I'm blinded up here.